shine on Happy Camper Life. We're loving, living, and learning online on Happy Camper Life.
Welcome to My Camp Podcast, brought to you by Happy Camper Live in this very special series called My Camp Lives On. I'm David Miller, and I'm your host. And this series of podcasts honors the history of camps that were open for many, many years, had brought treasure troves of memories to thousands of campers and counselors, but unfortunately have closed their doors. I would like today's guest to please introduce yourself to our audience.
Hi, I'm Jeff Moss. I started going to camp in 1954.
And what camp are we revisiting today, my friend?
Camp Harlee for boys, Camp Mitchell for girls.
Known as Camp Harlee Mitchell.
Right.
So Jeff, why don't you start, before we talk about the history of the camp and we reminisce that way, what is your background?
Well, I started doing shows in camp when I got there. I'm still doing it now. I'm a professional theater director and producer.
So Jeff, tell me about your Zoom background that you're using today.
Oh, well, this is a page from Uncle Eddie Mitchell's Bible. This edition started in 1940. Camp started in 1909. But behind me is the page of my enrollment in June, I might say, when I was 9 and a half in 1954 to Camp Harlee, where my dad and his sister had gone before me.
So I didn't even know that your dad and your aunt went to Harlee Mitchell. So can you give everybody just the true history of one of America's first camps?
Harlee Mitchell was started by William and Harriet Mitchell. It was a Y camp first in New York State. They bought it and moved it to Tyler Hill, Pennsylvania, where they bought the Singer estate. And started as a camp, a private camp in 1909. And it was in existence through 1957 with the Mitchells. And it was a pioneering camp. It was the first private camp in that neighborhood, one of the first private camps in America. And they were very active as camp directors. She was gone by the time I got there, but their son, Eddie Mitchell, took over running the camp, and he was the camp director when I got there.
And where'd the word, so that's the Mitchells, and Harlee came into?
Her name was Harriet Lee, and they named the boys' camp Harlee and the girls' camp Mitchell.
But the camp, as you were just talking, you said Camp Mitchell and Camp Harlee, but it was known as Camp Harlee Mitchell.
Yes, it was called Harlee Mitchell, yes. But they were two separate campuses, and there were some shared facilities.
So Uncle Eddie took over in the 50s, and
no, Uncle Eddie actually took over in the late 30s. He was on the road to be a theater director, and his father, who was the owner and director of the camp, died suddenly. Actually, was run over by a taxi one morning in New York City, and Uncle Eddie became the camp director. But he never forgot he was going to be a theater director because he had his hands in anything that had to do with presentation and shows and great events, color war breaks. He invented color war. He invented the color war breaks.
Is that true?
Of course it's true.
Oh, because you said so. And
that's right, of course.
And this is your episode. You are the guest.
Right. They were the first ones to have color war. They were the first ones to do all that. I don't think anybody else was shot out of a cannon to break color war except Uncle Eddie Mitchell. So far.
So far. So tell us about your earliest memories of camp. 9.5 years old, right, from Long Island, right? And
yes.
How'd you get to camp? And just that first,
yes,
those first memories.
Yes. Well, I had heard about Camp Harlee for a long time from my dad and his sister. She had been a camper there. My dad had, by the time she went to camp, he was her older brother. He was there kind of as a counselor. And what he told me was he brought up the first motor for boats at camp on Laurel Lake. And I have pictures of them. in camp. But I'd grown up with this idea that someday I would, if I was good, I would go to Camp Harlee. And sure enough, that year they decided I could go. They took me into New York to the Empire Hotel, which is on 66th and Broadway, because I live near there now. And I got on a bus, and I got off the bus 3.5 hours later. The bus pulled up in front of a giant building with 4 columns, and there was a big sign that said, "Welcome to Harlee Mitchell." I looked at the green grass, and my life changed. And I remember that day just like it was yesterday. And every day that I go to an opening day at camp, that's the feeling I'm trying to reproduce. It was very exciting.
Did you know, so obviously you had history at the camp. When you went that summer, did you know anybody else? Did you go with a friend or a
No,
relative?
I knew nobody. I knew nobody.
Really?
No, knew nobody. As you can see from behind me, it was a very late decision. They didn't decide to send me until June. And I knew that my family had been there, and we were a kind of camp family, but I was new. I didn't know anybody. But on the other hand, I remember Aunt Ethel, Uncle Eddie's wife, coming over to me and welcoming me that day. So that
And
was
how many boys and how many girls were at that camp?
they averaged about 120 boys and 120 girls. And at the very end of the Mitchell family in 56, they had almost 150 in each camp.
Wow.
And what had happened there is in 1949, unfortunately, they had polio, which was the ironic thing. People would send their kids to camp to stay away from polio. And it came to camp. The doctor evidently brought it. And several kids were affected, and they closed camp in the middle of the season that year.
Right. Yes. For those that don't know, a lot of the private camps outside of New York City area, whether it was the Catskills or Wayne County, Pennsylvania, or wherever it was an opportunity where parents wanted to send their children to be safe and get them out of the city, away from polio, because obviously the vaccine had not been developed yet.
And one of the ironic things in life was that when my family moved to Rockville Center in 59, where I went to middle school and high school, our neighbor's kids were one of the kids affected by the polio at Harlee Mitchell in 1949.
Wow.
Our next door neighbors. So.
And how many boys? You remember how many kids were in your bunk that year, or cabin? What you call it?
Bunk. E3 and 4. There were 7 of us on one side, and let's see, 1, 2, 3. I think 8 on the other side.
And mostly from the New York metropolitan area?
Yes, the Mitchells lived in Queens, and that was a big drawing ground for them. There weren't that many people from Long Island. They were mostly from Queens. A lot of them went to the schools in Queens. Joe Romer, who eventually became the boys' head counselor, was at Russell Sage. That was his stomping ground, Eddie Mitchell.
And how many years did you spend as a camper?
Sorry, say it again. How many what?
How many years were you a camper?
I've been a camper for 70 years. Oh, you mean there?
Yes, before you put the staff shirt on.
Well, I was a camper there from 54 until I became a staff person in 62.
Okay. And did you take any summers off, or you went?
No, I've never taken a summer off from camp. Ever.
To this day.
To this day.
That's right.
Why would I?
That's right.
Why would one do that?
It doesn't make any sense.
No, of course not.
And
no matter who's there.
And even in that summer a couple of years ago, where we had where camps didn't open, you managed to do some work at your camp, did you not?
I certainly did, because that's what you do in the summer. You go to camp.
That's right.
I mean, I think the world would be a better place if everybody went to camp.
Okay. That's what our audience is here for, right?
Right.
So tell us, so the history continued on, and then it became a different camp. So what was the transition from Harlee Mitchell to Laurel Lake?
Well, in 56, evidently, I only remember hearing stories that there were Eddie Mitchell had two other brothers, and the mother had left the camp to the three of them. Harriet was the one who survived, and then she left it to the three brothers. And they, having come out of the polio episode, and they were actually, I think, close to making money. The last in '56, they had a very full camp. They wanted out. And somehow or another, they couldn't deal with it. And Eddie, I don't know, spent too much money on the color war break. And eventually, they filed for bankruptcy and sold the camp at auction on the steps of the main house, Laurel Lake House, that fall. And three parents got together to buy the camp with the idea of holding on to it until the Mitchells could reorganize. And that's how it became Laurel Lake. For 2 years, it was run by Shirley Strauss, who had been the girls' head counselor, and one of the people who had been one of the management people at camp and had kids there, and another guy whose children had grown up there, was still there. And that was pretty successful. It became Laurel Lake Camps, and Eddie and Ethel were there for one summer, and evidently that somehow did not work out. They did not come back the second summer. So these three parents were left holding this camp. And one of them suffered a heart attack. Lou Eisen had a heart attack, and they decided to sell. And they sold to Bert Weinberg, who had just left his brother in Pocono Highlands. And that's when they took over Laurel Lake in '59, and they held it until '66. And he closed it in '66.
How fascinating. And you know that like one of the other camps that we were featuring was With a Wind, which was all in Waymart, Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Same year, 1966 was their last operating summer.
Yeah. Bert Weinberg he couldn't make it work. They couldn't find the formula to make it work. He was a Philly and Jersey-based guy. He had come out of Pocono Highlands. I don't know that he was the recruiter there. I don't know what he knew, but they had a hard time managing it. It was hard.
So tell us about some of the physical buildings, because I know that camp was kind of known as having some of the best camp buildings in the entire industry.
Right. Well, everything there except for the main house, which was part of what was the Singer estate, they told us, which housed the two dining rooms. Oh, the girls' dining room was in what was a ballroom, and they extended the building, made the boys' dining room. The camp started in tents because my dad told me about going to, sleeping in tents. But eventually they built the buildings that were necessary. They built bunks. They were painted white. They built the campuses. The boys' camp was in one square around trees and a flagpole, and the girls' camp was in a square around trees and a flagpole. And then they built, first they built a building, a kind of barn building, and someplace there's a picture of them having boxing there in the '30s. And eventually in 1940, they built the social hall, which was a major camp building. It was on 2 floors. The main floor was a basketball court with a stage, a proper stage with a proper fly rig over it where the scenery went up and down. That should be in all camp buildings. Eddie Mitchell wanting to be a theater director, of course, this was a big part of his activities at camp. The building had a balcony where the parents could sit and watch, because parents were very much part of Harlee Mitchell. Harlee Mitchell had an ongoing all summer visiting policy, and the other buildings in camp were hotel buildings. There were 3 other hotel buildings on the campus where parents stayed, and there were bungalows where the parents stayed. So that the weekends were very much about the kids, the parents, and the activities the parents were going to see at night. And the dining room catered to not only the kids, but to the parents. They would reset the girls' dining room at night for each meal for the parents. And they would go to the hotels in the mountains, take those menus, and that's the food they would serve because that's what that was their competition, were parents going to hotels or parents coming to Harlee Mitchell for the weekend.
And they would charge the parents for the
Oh,
weekend?
yes. That Eddie Mitchell told me eventually that's where they were making their money.
Interesting.
And the parents in the 50s. And of course, he, being a showman, his thing was every weekend to have something special that would attract the parents. So he invented things. He invented something called a lawn fete, which was a celebration of their anniversary. Eddie and Ethel were married in 1932 on July 24th on the front lawn of Harlee Mitchell with all the campers there and the parents and their guests. And they celebrated that every summer at a huge lawn party, which the kids went to. We had to have a date. We were dated up, paired up, could you imagine? And the parents came and the parents danced, and they would bring the band from the Wayne County Country Club, which was across the lake, owned also by that family, to that event. So it was a huge party.
Wow.
And he invented something called Harleo. Harleo was very hard to describe, unique event where Eddie and the staff would have this show to start with, some strange, crazy show. One year, Eddie was in a rocket ship that flew through the social hall onto the stage. One year, they reproduced what was the canteen, Eddie's hideaway, on the stage, and it went crazy. He had a dream. He fell into a huge bathtub of ice cream at the end. And then they would play bingo called Harleo, and you would get bingo cards. And the parents would buy bingo cards, and they would buy them for the kids, and the kids would have them. And if you won bingo, when you came up on the stage and rang the bell and said Harleo, you got a prize. Sometimes it was watermelon, sometimes it was cases of Coke, or prizes. But it was a huge, crazy night. And parents used to, want to come up and be part of it. My parents would say, oh, yeah, let's come up for Harleo this year. And then there was the big show. The big show, the last show of the summer, was always some Broadway title performed by counselors and the waiters, many of whom came to camp to be in the show, and directed by whoever the drama counselor was and Uncle Eddie. And it was there in 1956. He sent a stenographer to My Fair Lady on Broadway, wrote down the script, and they did My Fair Lady.
Wow.
Yeah, it was.
Now, did you direct shows at?
Eventually at Laurel Lake, I became the drama counselor. Yes.
What was the first show you directed?
The first show I directed there was a tribute to the shows on Broadway.
Like a review?
Yes, like a review. By the way, the director of My Fair Lady in 1956 was a young guy by the name of Marvin David Levy. Marvin David Levy became a significant opera composer, and his opera, Elektra, opened this Metropolitan Opera building many years later.
I was going to ask, any famous alum?
Richard Rodgers went to Harlee Mitchell for 2 summers.
Right.
And me.
And you. and Max.
Oh, well, that's another story. Max Weinberg. Max Weinberg's dad was the owner of Laurel Lake. And Max, I take complete credit for Max's musical career because I would say to him, Max, leave me alone and go practice the drums. He was in all the shows. He played Billy Crocker in Anything Goes. And a really nice guy.
Max Weinberg, of course, is the drummer for the E Street Band,
Right.
Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band, and still a good friend of yours, correct?
Yes.
So
Nice
in terms
guy.
of in terms of the way the program worked, was it completely brother sister? What kind of co-ed activities were there? Because you mentioned 2 separate dining rooms. So
Yes.
when did the boys and girls get together, except to go on a date for Uncle Eddie and
At the lawn fete.
anniversary party?
We came to the show. The shows were co-ed. There were shows throughout the summer for various groups. Those were co-ed activities, and there were evening activity game shows where we would come to the social hall and be a co-ed camp. Other than that, it was very separate. The boys had a large building called the Old Gym, which was a gym, a big, huge gym with basketball and rope climbing in it. And also in that building was boys' arts and crafts and boys' nature. And the girls had a building on the girls' campus called Brownie Hall, which the bottom of which was a large recreation kind of room, and the second floor was arts and crafts. So everything was very separate.
So no assembly. How often would brothers, like, no daily assembly together, because you said separate
Two
flagpoles.
separate, it was, yes.
So how often would a brother and sister see each other throughout the day or throughout the week, or?
Well, it was all about visiting, because every weekend there were visiting periods. Second period was visiting on Saturday and third period on Sunday. And if you had a sister or a brother, the parent would come and you could visit with each other for an hour.
How was the waterfront set up?
Boys waterfront, girls waterfront, guest waterfront. And the guest waterfront had a gazebo there. That became a significant part of camp.
So now I want you to tell us a very personal, funny story, not necessarily a prank that happened, but something that when you think about your days as a camper or staff member, that would be top 5 that can only happen at camp.
So there was this guy that none of us really liked on the staff, and we didn't know what to do to kind of teach him a lesson for being so annoying. So this is what we did.
Were you a staff member or a camper?
A staff member. We woke him up at 1 o'clock in the morning and told him that the linen service was coming the next day, a day early, and we needed a count of all the towels and linens that were being picked up the next day. And he should go through the bunks, count them. And when he got all that information, it was very important that Bert and Ruth Weinberg, the directors of the camp, knew the information, because the guy was coming very early in the morning. And so we did. And so he did. And yes, he woke them up at 6 in the morning to a very tired and angry Bert and Ruth Weinberg. Was, what the hell are you doing here? So that was like the ultimate punishment.
And
yes, I remember the most exciting and funny thing that we ever did as a kid. Uncle Sid Rakita, used to wake up the camp in the morning and say, "Good morning, juniors. How are you?" And all the juniors would yell back from their bunks, "Good morning, Uncle Sid." And he'd go around the campus. So one day, the counselors decided to steal the camp. And they stole the boys' camp. We woke up at 6 in the morning. We got into our pajamas and our bathrobes, and we walked way past the social hall where nobody could see us and hid back there. And sure enough, we heard Uncle Sid on the PA, "Good morning, juniors." No response. He went around, no response. And he really didn't know about this. And he was like panicked. Where are these kids? And of course, eventually they took us into the dining room. And there he came into the dining room. And we all said, "Good morning, Uncle Sid." When you're 9 years old, that's a big event.
That's a big event. Now, you have told stories of Uncle Eddie and some prized color war breaks.
Yes. Okay.
I need your top 2.
Okay, top 2. My very first summer, the big show was the Connecticut Yankee, which is about King Arthur and 2 people from Connecticut who go back to medieval times. When the show was over and everybody came out of the social hall, across the field, the lights came on, and there was a mountain that had not been there before. And standing on top of the mountain was a man who looked very much like King Arthur. And in front of King Arthur was a rock with a stone in it, with a sword in it, a rock with a sword. And as soon as everybody gathered, 2 horses decked out in armor with knights on them came riding out from behind the mountain. We didn't have horseback riding then. And Uncle Eddie declared that he was calling the bravest people in camp up to the mountain. He called up the color war generals, and he pulled the sword out of the rock and declared color war. When you're 9 years old, that's pretty impressive.
How did he, do you even know what the mountain was made out of?
Wood and canvas. Wood and canvas. And I guess they just moved it in and did it and put the lights on it. There's a picture of that someplace. I have a picture of that someplace. And then the next year, at the carnival, which was always on a weekend, so the parents could be there, they had daredevil feats. They had people do tricks. There were cars that ran up a ramp and rolled over people lying, in front of the ramp. There were people doing magic tricks. And finally, Uncle Eddie appeared as Mr. Zero. Mr. Zero was going to be shot out of a cannon that was placed on the other side, outside the girls' campus, on one of the ball fields. And we had seen it all week. It looked like a cannon to me. I was 10 years old. And sure enough, Uncle Eddie put on his helmet, put on his uniform, waved goodbye to everybody, went out of the gate of the girls' campus. And 2 minutes later, we heard this huge explosion. And we looked up at the top of Brownie Hall, which was a 2-story building on the girls' camp, which had a big sign that said Carnival. And over the top of that building came Uncle Eddie. Mr. Zero came over the top of that building, and all of a sudden, smoke came through the sign, and following Uncle Eddie was a huge, huge sign that said, "You're right, this is Color War, 1955.
All right. Now, so what happened? Because I've heard you tell this story, but what was the prank? Or do you not know? Do you still think to this day he came out of that cannon?
Of course, it was Uncle Eddie out of a cannon. No, Andy Bodick, who told me many years later, the maintenance guy at camp, they made a dummy. And after the explosion, he threw it over the top of the sign, and it was attached to this big banner that came down that said Color War. But most of us remember that. Most of us remember that, want to remember that it was Uncle Eddie.
And it was. And,
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting idea of having an actual banner that falls and actually would say Color War in Olympics. What do you think about that?
That's right. One has to have those. One has to have one of those. When you go to camp, you have to have one of those ready to go at any moment.
Just in case
case
something goes wrong,
right.
They know that it's the real break. I mean,
you got it.
Because practice. You're not sure it's going to go.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Yeah, no, he was known for his very famous Color War. I wasn't there when, at the end of South Pacific, I think in 1950, Bali High exploded during the curtain call. Blue and white smoke came out. It was Color War.
Were you blue and white? I was going to ask.
Blue and white
color?
Yes. White Trailblazers, blue Buccaneers, Majestic Whites, navy blue. Oh yeah.
And girls and boys, Color War was separate.
Separate. Eventually, they were joined at Laurel Lake. We joined them, but at Harlee Mitchell, they were separate, completely separate events. Boys sing, girls sing.
So sing was part of part of Color War, and they were completely separate. There were no girls singing on the boys' teams.
Boys team, girls team, completely different. Four Color War banners every year.
Right. So tell me, here we stand now in 2023. So obviously, even Laurel Lake ceased existing in 1966. What kind of alumni events and what kind of what has been done besides this incredible podcast that you're doing to keep the memory of Harlee Mitchell alive?
Well, before social media, that was really hard because who knew who was there? And I knew because I had the opportunity of going back to those campgrounds in the summer and very often met people there. And the local people that I knew would say, there's always somebody here walking around. That was in the 70s and 80s. But in 1982, someone got the idea of having a Harlee Mitchell reunion. And we did. We had a wonderful, wonderful Harlee Mitchell reunion. It happened to be Eddie and Ethel's 50th anniversary that year. And I found them, and they were more than happy to do it. And we spent a year planning this event, which we held in a hotel in Tarrytown, and there were over 200 people there. And it was just an amazing thing because the history of the camp was so long. There were so many people there. There were head counselors. We had 4 or 5 head counselors from each side, and it was great. It was wonderful. That
there were
feeling
very-
is, that feeling is so special. Your camp friends.
There are very few people that I've met in my life that truly will say camp is at the essence of who they are. And Jeff Moss is one of those people. How many summers have you spent in summer camp, my friend?
70. This will be my 70th summer at camp.
70th summer at camp.
Yeah.
And it all came from the foundation of the camp that we're talking about today,
Right.
Harlee Mitchell.
Right.
So to end this, I guess we're going to have to hear the alma mater of Harlee Mitchell. So whenever you're ready, let us have it.
The Harlee alma mater.
Please.
Camp days, how we miss them so, how we long to go back where we belong here at Camp Harlee, just the way you look tonight. Someday when we're feeling low, when the world is cold, we know where we will go, back to Camp Harlee, just the way you look tonight.
Thank you
We
very
won.
much.
1955, we won that alma mater. Blue Buccaneers won that alma mater. And the Camp Mitchell alma mater. Want to hear that?
Yes, of course.
Camp Mitchell, fair and true, in our hearts we belong to you, and we love all the old and new that we think of when we are gone. Sunsets and starry nights are our cherished and fond delight as we linger by pale moonlight and await the awakening dawn.
Very familiar.
Very familiar.
Very, very, very
Very
familiar.
familiar.
This
A
was
winning
awesome.
color worth, by the way, a winning color worth song.
I love the fact that the camps were brother, sister, and had 2 separate alma maters.
Yeah.
And that's the way that it stayed. So
Yes, yeah, it's very interesting that it was very much a boys' camp and a girls' camp that lived together and did this once in a while, but the boys and girls were very separate. The idea of the boys' camp, girls' camp was very strong.
right. Well, thank you, Jeff, for joining us and sharing your memories of, I know, a place that holds a place in your heart forever and ever. And I
Yeah.
want to thank our audience for joining us. You can find us in more episodes on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you choose to watch your podcasts. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Take a moment to shine on Happy